Chapter 14. The Rabbit in the Moon. When Bligh awoke late the next morning, he was surprised to see Fletch and Alariana's hammock swinging empty, and the little dinghy that had been towed behind the ship gone. Floating up to the main deck, he saw a sliver of misty land lying in the far distance across the horizon. It must be Tenir.
"I think they left some time in the early hours,"
said Seaward, who was soaking strips of cloth in a bucket of cold water.
"Without telling anyone?"
asked Bligh, disappointed he'd missed the chance to say goodbye. Seaward nodded.
"I have a feeling the young miss thought it was best."
He wrung out the strips of cloth and began binding them tightly around Morland's ankle, which was resting on another bucket, looking green and swollen. The rest of the sailor was looking very sour.
"Ask yourself,"
he snapped when he noticed Bligh looking.
"It's a sprain."
Seaward gave Bligh one of his "it's better if you don't ask" looks as he finished wrapping Morland's foot.
"There,"
he said, wiping his hands dry on his jerkin.
"That should slow down the swelling if you keep it cold. Should last 30 minutes, I reckon. Give us a shout if it starts getting too painful again. And then the little Master Abrian should be awake and back on duty."
"Much obliged, Seaward. But we have enough pains gliding about the decks already,"
Morland muttered, swinging his foot off its rest and hobbling away, making sure to go through Bligh as if he wasn't there.
"Shame we couldn't wrap him up in something tight and cold. Stop him flying everywhere."
Bligh scowled, finding it harder and harder to ignore Morland. Out of all the Nausians, Morland struggled the most to tolerate their ghost, and this dislike had seemed to have only grown worse since they left Allaire. Bligh could already see the wings of blame for all the discomfort in Morland's foot fluttering inevitably towards him, even though Bligh hadn't the foggiest idea how it had been damaged.
"Sail!"
someone shouted from the whipstaff. Captain Oola pointed towards Tenir. A small, pale triangle of canvas was tacking zigzags over the deep green waves. After several minutes, it became clear the little boat was heading for the ship, and was, in fact, the very same craft that had left them the night before.
"Oh, did they change their minds?"
said Seaward, squinting at the bobbing shape.
"Bit of an odd decision, isn't it?"
said Bligh, frowning, though he did remember this was Fletch they were talking about. But it wasn't Fletch, and as the boat drew closer, a voice drifted over the wind, and Bligh's spirit leapt. "Hello!" "Is that?" asked Honno, running over to the rail to look. "I say, my dear Captain, sailors, filled notions, one and all! Would you mind slowing down your ship and lending a hand?" called Tepid, straining to keep the dinghy's sail under control while Morphea and Dominator clung onto stretching lines, and Delilah clutched onto the tiller as tightly as she could.
"How in the wide world did you manage this?"
said Captain Oola, bemused but pleased, as the four castaways were helped up on deck, looking tired but curiously well-groomed. Anyone below decks was soon awake, and the main deck became busy with people wanting to know how they'd found the ship again.
"You wouldn't believe half of it even if we told you,"
said Delilah breathlessly.
"After we left the people who pulled us out of the sea, we managed to get to a town, but there were no boats. We all got so tired, waiting all night for any sign. Then just before dawn we heard something being pulled up the beach. A couple of people were tugging this little dinghy out of the sea. We rushed over in the dark to beg them to let us take it. They said by all means, they didn't need it anymore. So we set out straight away and then saw the ship's lanterns on the horizon and, well, here we are."
"So they did head out early," said Abrian, smiling to himself. "I hope they have a safe journey."
"Ugh! What is that smell?"
shouted Annie and Dominator, charging towards each other but then repelled back by their respective whiffs. "We've had our share of adventures too," said Honno, pinching his nose and guiding the ponging pair out of the way. "And we've got the first ingredient for the potion poison pill."
"Good, because we've got a clue to finding the second,"
said Morphea, her eyes gleaming.
"But show us the Gormasosha. I want to see what it looks like."
As the group dispersed, shepherded back to work by the captain, who wanted to know everything Tepid had to report about Tenir, Delilah was left on deck. She spotted Bligh hovering by the ladder, and the widest smile broke across her face.
"That was an adventure, wasn't it?"
She laughed, brushing her hair out of her eyes as she ran over.
I wouldn't say getting thrown overboard was a good thing,
remarked Bligh.
I was really worried. Well, call it character building then,
said Delilah happily, but Bligh frowned. The massive sense of relief that had flowed up at the sight of Delilah had started to spill over into something else. Delilah was acting as if nearly drowning was nothing. Hadn't she even been scared?
You're pulling a face,
said Delilah, looking up at him.
It's nothing.
Bligh lied.
You float higher than me when something's bothering you.
Delilah grinned, standing on tiptoe. But Bligh didn't meet her eye.
I think I'd better get on with watch duty,
he said abruptly, making to fly away and leaving Delilah confused.
It won't last, laddie,
said Morland as Bligh passed him.
Your lady has no need to fuss on the worries of someone who's dead. Let her get on with living. You should keep your nose in your grave.
Something inside Bligh snapped. Quick as a flash, he turned over in mid-air and shot as hard and fast as a spear through Morland and vanished below decks.
Mr. Morland!
Captain Oola had materialised behind the sailor as if from thin air, as he always did when there was trouble.
Having a ghost on board might be bad luck, but making an enemy of a comrade on a small, floating wooden island is far worse.
Yes, sir,
said Morland quietly, keeping his eyes low.
Good,
said Oola.
You can keep watch today in place of our ghost. Be careful to mind your step,
he added with a dark smile, glancing up towards the swaying lookout point as he faded back into the depths of his cabin. The sun had set and Bligh still hadn't emerged from below decks. He had been curled up in his corner by the sleeping quarters all day, Morland's words still ringing in his ears. Sailors who hadn't even died once, pointless rain, giant fish knocking people into the sea. He felt sick of them all and was going to stay down there until they all realised how he felt. Delilah knew this was probably stewing in his head. She'd given him all day to come back and start being himself again, but now night was drawing in and she'd had enough. And Aluiciuous was always too dramatic for their own good. But Delilah knew if one had clammed up, the other was likely to get them to open up again, though it was going to take some persuading.
Where have you gone?
She muttered as she made a beeline towards where she knew EA would be lurking. She stormed past a startled Abrian. He almost asked what was going on, but had learned better than to disturb the daughter of the White Queen when she was on a mission. Striding along the top deck of the ship, she made her way over to the slumped figure of EA, who was, once again, nose deep in a book. Gina was hovering nearby. She'd been rehearsing in her head all day what she was going to say to him. So far it went something like,
Well, this is a boring evening, isn't it?
Which she hoped might lead to,
You know, I wish I could communicate better, but I really don't understand why we aren't friends like we used to be.
And perhaps even,
I won't turn into a puddle anymore if you just say something.
Unfortunately, that moment was not to be, as the force of nature that was Delilah swept past, sending Gina spinning.
Ahem,
said Delilah to EA, tapping her foot. No response.
ahem.
EA looked up from his book, annoyed at this disturbance. Yes?
Go talk to your brother right now,
Delilah demanded. Why? EA responded curtly.
Because he's not moved all day. He's in one of those moods where he's got all wound up worrying. He needs his big brother, Eldred.
Please go away, said EA. He was used to Delilah following them around from when they were younger, but he still wasn't comfortable with how oddly attached she was to GA now. It was all very strange to him. Delilah sighed and sat down slowly beside EA. Carefully, she prized the book out of his hands and replaced it with a folded piece of parchment.
In case you're not feeling empathic, I wrote you a script,
she said.
Please? The book will still be here when you come back.
She set it aside carefully, sliding it out of his reach as he made a move towards it. You won't let me not do this, will you? Delilah shook her head. Rolling his eyes, EA got up and headed in the direction of his brother. Stomping down the steps to the sleeping quarters, EA found him curled up as if he was asleep. EA knew better, though. If EA was asleep, he would be closer to the ground. At present, he floated nearly at eye level. Get up. Your limpet is worried about you, EA huffed as he wandered towards his brother, who was still pretending to be asleep. With no response, EA sighed. Drastic action was required. Peeling open the parchment, he squinted at Delilah's writing, blinked, frowned, then drew a deep breath. EA waited as his brother fell silent. Maybe if he didn't move, EA would go away, he thought, curling up tighter. Then something underneath him moved and he looked down, coming face to face with EA, who was lying on the floor looking up at him. I can see right up your nose. EA shouted as he uncurled and jumped a couple of feet up, away from his brother. Knew you weren't asleep, EA said.
What are you doing there?
Said Chie, trying to recover from the shock. Hey, why did Gina hide a soup in Hono's flask? Chie stared at his brother in confusion.
What?
Because there wasn't mushroom for anything else, EA said mechanically, ignoring Chie's confusion.
Was that a pun?
Chie asked, bewildered. What did Alariana want her adopted son to do?
EA, please don't.
Chie was getting increasingly concerned, but EA kept on. She got him to fletch stuff. Chie could feel the side of his mouth curling up slightly.
That was terrible,
he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Not as terrible as Gadav's breath. There was a pause. That wasn't even a pun, just the truth.
EA, why are you doing this?
Chie said, struggling not to laugh. I'm sorry. Your concerned Delilah accosted me and forced me to talk to you.
She what?
Chie looked away, trying to regain control of his bad mood.
I don't see why she'd be concerned.
EA glared at his twin. You realise the limpet will kill me if this doesn't work. But I told her it wouldn't.
Oh no. I know where this is going.
There was only the ghost of a chance.
Eldred Aluiciuous! If I wasn't an incorporeal being, I would slap you so hard!
Good thing you can't, because unless you stop sulking, there's more where that came from. This script is quite extensive.
Brother, please don't.
How did Gina get to this plane of reality?
Fine, I'm going!
Chie shouted as he floated out of the room to find Delilah. EA felt pleased his work was done. Now he could go back to reading. He looked back at the puns as he lay on the hard floor for a moment, quietly groaning to himself. They were truly awful, but, like it or not, the limpet had been right. They'd got EA to move. EA didn't like someone knowing his brother as well as he did, but he knew someday he'd have to accept that perhaps this was a good thing. This kept him deep in thought as he headed after his brother to fetch back his book. There were still a few more chapters to go, still more to know from it. He hoped it would be better than it had been so far. Some bits were too long-winded, others repeated information unnecessarily. It was far too introspective, and the footnotes led to pointless dead ends. When he reached the corner behind the whipstaff, however, a chunk of ice fell into the pit of his stomach. The book had vanished. Annie half dozed, leaning on the wet rail of the ship. No one bothered her. She was still followed by the aroma of fish vomit, but she didn't mind. It was nice and peaceful being back on the boat that night. Although, she blinked, looking at the rolling clouds. For a fleeting moment, she thought she could see a patch of sky darker than the rest. Squinting, it seemed like a rip or a tear filled with complete blackness. Annie didn't like it one bit, but couldn't help but stare. She wondered if she should tell someone, but then again, what could anyone do? She looked back at the dark tear and remembered what Fletch had told her. He had found Gadav when a crack appeared in the cave that vanished the next day. Maybe this was another one like it. Looking back at the rip, she saw 2 tiny lights appear, just discernible in the darkness. The corners of the tear began to move, as if the night sky was being threaded back together by invisible hands. Before she could see if it was finished, the ship had sailed on, and she couldn't watch any longer. Tepid sat up in his hammock. To say he felt rested would be a lie. Sweeping his hair out of his face, he let out a yawn. He wasn't sure why he was so restless tonight. Maybe it was the motion of the ship, or the fact that every few minutes Dominator would let out an almighty snore. He decided a little fresh air couldn't hurt. As he dressed, he could hear movements on the deck above. He quietly wondered to himself if the sailors ever actually slept. As he made his way further up, he could smell lanterns burning and hear the captain's voice fading in and out amongst the noise of the waves.
And so the two children escaped and lived happily in the woods,
the captain was saying. Coming out on deck, Tepid found all the sailors sat around a lantern, listening to the captain who stood by it, enthralled with his story like children at bedtime.
Good evening, Your Highness,
one of the sailors said, greeting the prince. His eyes were still adjusting, so Tepid wasn't really sure which one spoke, but he could definitely see the crew as they turned as one to face him. "Hello there," Tepid replied brightly. He may have been tired, but that was no excuse for a prince not to be charming.
Couldn't sleep?
The captain asked light-heartedly. "No, sadly not," Tepid responded. "Mind if I join you?"
Course not. I'm about to start another story.
The crew turned back expectantly to the captain on hearing this. "I do love a good story. Is it one I know?" Tepid asked, seating himself at the edge of the lantern light.
Probably not. It's not one they tell in Norcia,
the captain said, grinning.
It's from a land far, far away, where folks don't die, but live on in stories, and the only ghosts are the memories they leave. One such tale involves a rabbit, a fox, and a monkey.
Tepid furrowed his brow. He had no idea what any of those words meant. The captain, seeing his confusion, let out a chuckle before continuing.
For the uninitiated amongst us, rabbits are small, furry creatures with long ears.
He explained, gesturing in the air what this creature might look like.
Excuse me?
Hmm?
This is my story I'm telling.
Sorry.
We'll be quiet then.
Good. As I was saying, foxes are bigger, with long snouts and pointy ears. Crafty demons they are. Monkeys look a lot like you and me, except with far more hair. Some can be as tall as us, while others can sit in your hand.
Tepid now understood why the sailors were so interested in the captain's stories.
One day, an old man came to the three animals asking if they would spare him some food, for he was old and unable to forage for himself. The monkey went and collected fruits for the man from the tallest trees. The fox, being crafty and wicked, stole food from a nearby cottage. The rabbit, unsure of how to help, as he only knew how to collect grass, made a fire and threw himself into it for the old man's sake.
As the captain's voice rose to a crescendo, many of the sailors flinched or gasped.
But he did not die,
Oola continued.
Instead, it turned out the old man was a deity, and he was so moved by the rabbit's selflessness that he painted the rabbit's image onto the moon. He now spends his days making medicine for us mortals below.
The crew all sat staring in awe at the story. It was a bit on the short side for Tepid's liking, but he decided to stay quiet and look attentive. People liked it when you did that. The captain sighed, reaching for his pipe as the sailors dispersed and went back to their duties.
It was a beautiful ending, though the moon landings rather took away from the poetry of it all,
he said quietly, striking a match. Moon landing? Tepid repeated quizzically. Behind him, Bligh whispered quietly to the prince.
It's another Captain Oola-ism. An occasional something we don't understand, and only he does.
Is there a problem?
Said Oola, his pipe clamped between his teeth.
Not at all, sir,
said Bligh honestly.
If our captain isn't Nortian and talks of strange things, it's not our business to mind. We are on His Highness's mission, and you have been our captain for many times now. Where you lead, we follow, sir, as we should.
Tepid arched an eyebrow. He knew loyalty when he saw it. For a prince, it was an essential sense added to sight, hearing and humour. But scarcely had he seen it in such vast quantities, and it wasn't directed at him. He might be a prince, but on this ship he was a prince out of water, as it were. He knew who was really in charge on this adventure. All the same, he thought as he yawned and made for his hammock once more, there probably wasn't anyone more suitable than this captain, though he did have to wonder where in the wide world Oola found his stories. As the prince headed below, he said a polite "Good night" as he passed Delilah, who stood beside the rail. It was getting quite late, but at least the rain had stopped for a while. It was rarer than ever these days, but a cluster of strong breezes high up in the sky had managed to push away the clouds for a moment. Now the air was still, filled only with the gentle plip-plip from the dripping rigging as a smattering of stars began to chance an appearance above the rolling sea. A very cautious blue glow approached behind her. Delilah saw her shadow growing in front of her, but she didn't move. After a moment, out of the corner of her eye, she saw a tentative blue hand very cautiously trace its way along the rail to her own.
Feeling better now?
She said.
I'm sorry,
said Chie quietly, hoping she would know how silly he felt. Delilah snuggled close to the cold air around him and smiled.
Mogra, you're forgiven. What? It's old feld notion. It means my love.
Now the relief Chie felt that morning came flooding back, but this time it felt softer, kinder. Gladness. That was what he'd wanted to feel. It was about time, too. Chie shut his eyes for a moment and let it wash over him as the stars kept their silent vigil, and Delilah leaned close by his side.
I'm glad you're with me, Mogra.
The last of the ragged clouds pulled away to the east as they stood together, revealing a small moon rising over the edge of the sea. It had been so long since anyone had seen a moonrise. Its weak light grew brighter as it climbed into the indigo blanket above. A little way to their left, Chie noticed Captain Oola leaning on the side, blowing hazy blue smoke from his pipe into the night air.
Don't mind, do you?
He said when he noticed the pair of them. They shook their heads, and Oola turned his gaze back to the sky, seemingly lost in his own contemplations.
It's so beautiful tonight,
said Delilah quietly.
Is that why they call it the heavens?
Said a small voice beside them. Annie was sitting at the base of the mast.
I heard it once in a story. That's what some people call them.
The captain looked up thoughtfully.
I think it's because when you look at the sky, it tells you you're closer to the one that made you.
What do you mean?
Asked Chie.
I believe our captain is referring to the bigger world,
said Seaward, from where he was seated mending a fishing net.
There's the living world, the spirit world in between.
He nodded to Chie.
Then there's the biggest, overarching world, green fields. It encircles every world, even wherever our captain thinks he's from.
Who lives there, in green fields?
Asked Annie, turning around curiously. Seaward looked back at his net with a sigh and a smile.
I think some old friends of mine are there.
Annie wrinkled her nose, so Seaward elaborated.
It's where you go with your eyes shut. It's supposed to be where life really begins. Think of it like this. This world, the living world, is a lesson you learn. It grows you, so you're ready for the life that's waiting.
Do you have to die to go there?
Annie whispered, feeling nervous.
In a way, I suppose.
Shrugged Seaward.
But is it really death or a transition? Maybe it's a step on your way home. If we're speaking about stories, have you not heard the story of the first person to die?
There were a lot of books in the castle's library at home, but Annie couldn't think of any that were about that.
Well, I say story, but it's not a myth.
Seaward explained.
It's not a legend either. It's a story that's a truth passed from one person to the next. Long, long ago, the fabric of reality was impenetrable. No one in the living world could ever leave it. We all know living isn't easy sometimes, and this was a living without an end. Without an end to illness, sadness, or anger, and there's no escape from it. One day, a person chose to fix it. Their heart was strong, and they used it to break through to the netherworld. Then they travelled all the way across it. Must have been a very hard journey, but finally they reached green fields. There was a door, and only a heart like theirs could open it. And they did. It said all the good in the world came from the open door and still seeps through today. Then they came back across that distance to show everyone the way there. It said he guides souls to green fields when the time is right, but only he knows the best time.
Point is, he gives us all a chance to take.
Oh,
Annie felt rather overwhelmed.
it's a lot to think about.
Of course,
Grinned Seward.
it's a mystery.
But you know all about it?
Said Hiei, perplexed.
A mystery isn't something hidden.
Said Seward, waving his net tools at him.
It's a truth. So big. We'll never fully understand it. Not in the living world. There's a lot I don't understand, but I like the parts I do.
Well said.
Smiled Captain Oola.
Nothing wrong with not always knowing everything. Our failed notions have taught me that much.
He winked at Delilah and Hiei. Seward laughed.
Well, I've always said I don't care where you're from, sir.
Back to your post now,
Said Captain Oola, tapping the ash from his pipe as he straightened up.
or the whippets will have you.
What were their names, sir?
Seward called. Oola paused, leaning on his doorframe.
I called one Grommet. I can't remember the other.
He touched his knuckle to his forehead and shut the door. The deck fell silent again. Annie looked up at the sky again, seemingly free of any dark rips or tears. She wiped her nose, her head playing with all these new thoughts. The world seemed to have more folded corners and layers than she'd ever known before. She smiled to herself. At least whichever world she was from, there was one where she was welcome.